It's back. The Pen to Publish podcast is having two more series added, and we're excited to be talking again about all things writing and publishing. If you're planning to pen and publish, then this podcast is for you. The next two series will be covering more writing and editing tips and includes all of the issues we see repeated time and time again with new writers. The feedback from the last 6 series have been so positive, and we are being listened to as far-flung from Australia and Qatar, and now obviously Canada too. We're really excited to be coming back and bringing you more wonderful pen and writing info. Ready for your weekend listening. I'm Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher. And
I'm Alexa Tewkesbury, author, editor, and proofreader. Now, we have lots of writing resources for you, which can be found on our Pen to Published website, where you'll also find all the show notes and guest information for each episode too. There's also our Writers Refinery Facebook group, which you can join. If you just look for the Writers Refinery, this is a great place to meet and interact with other writers and authors, and we'd love to see you there. And we also love getting feedback because that really helps with our rankings. So please do leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening on. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you get notified when there are new episodes available. Now, there is also the interim putty pods. Now, these are bite-sized episodes of word wisdom, so do look out for those too. Right, let's get started.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Pen to Publish podcast. And today we are going to be talking about dialogue, one of my favourite things to talk about, and I'm not going to get ranty.
There is so much to say about dialogue, I have to be honest. When I was putting this together, I thought, well, we can do this episode, but I think we might also need to do a putty pod because there is so much to say about it. Yeah, it's surprising, really. It's not a quick thing to discuss.
No. And I also have, just as a supplementary bonus, I am currently just finishing off a blog post about hyphens, N dashes and M dashes, but I have a blog post up about how you format speech in your novel as well on my blog. So what I'm going to do in the show notes, I will make sure there's a link in the show notes explaining how you format dialogue in your novel too, because that's important as well.
It is important. And even though writers are readers, because, you read books and that's sort of why you want to write them, it's very easy for the way the dialogue should be presented to be overlooked. And I think what a lot of people forget is the comma. There's the little bit of speech, then there's a comma, then you close the speech marks before the speech tag. And a lot of times either the comma will be outside the speech tag or it won't be there at all. So that'll be really useful for people who aren't so sure exactly how to punctuate dialogue.
Right, so come on then, Alexa, let's kick off.
Okay. Well, I thought I'd start with just a very aesthetic point. I don't know if that's the right thing, but there are so many benefits to including dialogue in fiction, and purely aesthetically, I don't know, tell me if that's the right use of the word in a minute, but purely aesthetically, from the point of view of white space on the page, which these days is what we want. If you think of guidelines for planning website text and blog posts, it says incorporate plenty of space, the reader isn't overwhelmed by what's on the screen. Now, dialogue is just a great way to break text up physically, so when a reader reaches a page with dialogue, their brain can kind of relax. And when you think about the layout of speech, every time a new character says something, it has to appear on a new line. So you've got shorter lines, shorter paragraphs, and that all helps with the sense of white space. And as long as your dialogue is good, that means presenting your reader with pages that are easier and quicker to read, which affects their interpretation, I suppose, of the pace of the novel.
Definitely. I think aesthetically is absolutely the right word.
It is the right word. Oh, okay, because I'm not sure I've ever actually used that before. I've heard other people say it, but anyway, so a first. Now, I do think for some people it's easier to write dialogue than others. I personally love writing dialogue. It's something that just sort of takes off for me once it gets going. But other people maybe not so much. Maybe their strength is more action sequences or descriptive passages. And when it comes to characters interacting verbally, that doesn't come so easily to them. But what I would say is don't avoid dialogue, because what it does for your novel is it brings it to life. It creates a variety of pace. It makes the characters accessible and relatable, and it's another way to move the plot forward. And in, say, a novel that's otherwise quite bleak, it allows for moments of humour. So basically, it is just really important. Right, so how do you write great dialogue? I think the key thing with it is that you want it to be engaging. So as with all writing, it needs to be pared down, and that don't don't give your character verbal diarrhea unless that's a particular trait of that character. Now, when we talk, we meander, we repeat ourselves, as Alexa knows from editing these podcast episodes.
I repeat
We
myself
do.
so much. It's
Oh, so do
embarrassing.
I. But we don't realize we're doing it, but we do it. I do it too. And we don't stick to the point. We go off piste. But written dialogue in a book, it needs to be punchy and concise. Give your characters the words to say that need to be said and no more. There has to be a point to a conversation in fiction. As you mentioned last week, I think, Alexa, a conversation about how someone takes their coffee is not interesting. Coffee? Oh, yes, please. How do you take it? Oh, white, please, no sugar. I used to drink nothing but black coffee, but these days I want something more creamy. I always dunk a biscuit too. Oh, so do I. Nothing better than a soggy Garibaldi. That might work on TV, but in a book, it slows the pace and takes the reader off the point. You can mention that the characters are having a coffee, but there doesn't need to be a whole exchange about it. So let the small talk go. The energy in dialogue isn't in the small talk, it's in the crispy, snappy exchange that has a point, a reason to be there. If you think your story is needing momentum, so needing to drive itself forward to keep the reader engaged, you could keep checking with yourself. You can ask yourself, what is the point of this scene that I'm writing? And within that, what do my characters want from this piece of dialogue? Are they trying to find something out? Are they trying to cover something up with a lie? Are they posing a threat? Are they getting important information over to the reader without the author having to spell it out? Are they dropping in a piece of backstory? For example, someone might say, I wasn't here then, I was working in Nigeria. So suddenly you've introduced a new aspect to your character. Very naturally, you've just dropped it in without holding up the story with any kind of explanation that at one time the character had some job or other in Nigeria. And what dialogue helps to do as well is create character. The way someone speaks says so much about them. The way they interact verbally with others also says a lot about the way they relate to those people. You can really expose character through dialogue in a way you can't if you're just describing it. Dialogue is a way of showing your reader someone's personality rather than telling them what it's like. Just describing someone's personality is heavy going for a reader. It's just not interesting. It's much better to demonstrate it through how they speak and what they say. What you as the writer need to have, therefore, is a thorough knowledge and understanding of your characters. How would they react to this or that person? And what is their status with regard to each other in this scene? If you have someone who's generally more placid and even-tempered and you pitch them into a conversation with someone who's more excitable or who's trying to wind them up, the reader needs to see and experience that tension in the dialogue. And think about the language your characters will use. Is their speech quite colloquial? Is it more formal? Do they swear? What words might one character use that another character would never use? Is there a saying they have that might crop up at different points? Now, there's a series of children's books that Alexa and I have been working on for quite a while, and the situations are funny and ridiculous. And a phrase I
I know,
introduced for the
I know,
main character.
I know exactly what you're going to say. Oh, yes.
I introduce this phrase for the character to say when he's surprised. And it's, well, blow me down with a something. Well, blow me down with a pitchfork or blow me down with a fishing rod. The something will be an item connected in some way with the story, but well, blow me down is like a catchphrase for this character. None of the other characters say it or anything like it. But so you can see that there's such an opportunity to differentiate effectively between your protagonists in how you make them speak. I think something else to remember is to try to keep each individual speech as short as possible. This isn't about creating monologues within your novel. If one character has a lot they need to say, try to break it up with interjections from another character and with a bit of action. So, for example, a character might have been speaking for a while, say Joanna, might have been speaking for a while, but you want to break that up. So you could add, Joanna fell silent and walked over to the window. It was as if she'd forgotten her brother was there. She gazed outside into the greyness, the rain. At last she spoke again. And just by adding something like that, you've put the reader back in the room with the person who's speaking. You've not got so lost in what they're saying that you've sort of forgotten where you are and who the other person is talking to. So with one long, unbroken speech, it can feel as though that character has taken over. The structure of the book loses its balance. The pace is messed with. Long speeches in fiction mean the dynamism of two or more characters having a conversation is lost. Now, as we mentioned at the start, think carefully about your use of punctuation in dialogue. Now, punctuation can speed dialogue up or it can slow it down. Perhaps you have a character who speaks in quite long sentences, in which case your punctuation marks will be sparing. But if it's the opposite, you're going to need a lot of punctuation to deliver short, sharp sentences. So, for example, you might have, no, I'm not going. You can't make me go. So that's no, full stop. I'm not going, full stop. You can't make me go, full stop. Then when the other person speaks, they might be interrupted by this first person. But we haven't been there for so long. I just thought, no, go away. When you have an interruption like that, it usually appears in books as a long dash with no space before it. And then the reply, no, full stop, go away. And for extra drama, you could add an exclamation mark. But I think we did a putty pot on this. You do need to be careful with exclamation marks. If you use them a lot, it just becomes exhausting for the reader because it's just this constant, somebody firing something at you all the time. And again, that takes away the variety that you need of pace and emotion. But used sparingly and at just the right moment, I think they can be very effective. And you can hear in that example, no, go away. You can hear how the use of the punctuation mark there, the exclamation mark, helps to convey a character's emotions. And then dialogue tags, Alexa 2's favorite.
Dialogue
so he
tags.
said, she said, they said. Again, these are something. Sorry.
No. I was going to interrupt. Stephen King and I actually disagree with dialogue tags, and there's not much I disagree with Stephen King. He says that he said, she said, use them all the time, and people don't see them. I disagree. I think you do see them, and I don't think you need dialogue tags often. I think they should be used sparingly. But Alexa, you will no doubt educate us.
No, sparing is good. I think sparing is good. So that's it, for anyone who's not clear, dialogue tags, that's he said, she said, they said, all those kind of.
Or the character name.
Things.
Daniel said.
Yes.
Tracy said. And don't treat us like idiots. You don't need to keep telling us who's talking. If it's just two people talking in a room, you don't need to keep repeating the name.
It's an interruption and it's repetitive. So these are something that you need to be careful with. You need to use just enough tags, I think, so that your reader doesn't get confused as to who's speaking, but not so many that it gets into that sort of annoyingly repetitive pattern. If only two people are speaking, as you said, you can be sparing, just reminding the reader now and again who the speaker is. And if there are two or more people, you're going to have to use them a little more frequently. Now, I like to use them in the middle of a speech. So I mentioned before about breaking up longer speeches. A speech tag is another way to do that, provided it's not a very long speech. You probably want something longer, as I mentioned before, with a very long speech. But you can still use a tag in the middle if there are a few lines. And sometimes, I don't know, I think it just seems to work rhythmically. Sometimes in my editing, I will move a speech tag from the end and put it in the middle. There's just something about breaking up the dialogue with the speech tag that I think works well. And also, don't let particular tags overshadow a conversation. To a large extent, it should be evident in what the characters are saying and in the mood of the scene and the particular point in the story, how they are delivering their speech. So if you think of the go away that I just used as an example, where you could add an exclamation mark, this character is using short, sharp sentences in this scene. Everything that went before, short and sharp. They interrupted the speaker in the scene. They told them to go away. This person is clearly not happy. So there's no need to add, go away, she shouted, or she snapped,
Oh,
or she exclaimed.
oh,
You've got go
oh,
away. You've got the exclamation mark. That's everything the reader knows.
oh. It
And
just,
something else Alexa
oh,
hates is shouted.
I know. It's like, don't assume the reader's an idiot. And if you have a particular speech tag that you want to use, and I'm going to use this example because it is in a set of books by J.L. Ross, Murmured. We've talked about this before. All her characters murmur. And it's such an unusual description, but to have it 3 times on a page, like, do these characters just not talk properly? How many times do you murmur, Alexa, in everyday
Yeah,
life?
I mean, murmuring is normally you might murmur it to yourself, don't you? You murmur something under your breath.
Yeah.
We don't murmur conversations to each other particularly. No, that's an unusual choice.
And also, if with your very good example that you gave with, go now, another way of talking, which is actually very rare, but described a lot in books, is shouted.
Mm.
How many times actually do you shout? I mean, I can't remember the last time I shouted. Actually, I do.
No.
I do remember the last time I shouted. It was about a year ago. But you don't shout in normal, even when you're having a heated conversation with someone. Shouting takes a lot of effort. And if you have a character that's always shouting or is described as shouting or screaming in a novel, and you're taking the reader on this journey, if you're an empathetic reader, you're going to be exhausted by the end of the novel because actually very few people shout.
Mm.
And
I
yet
think it.
I know it's used as a speech tag a lot in books.
Mm. I think it. I think in a very tense situation, maybe like I don't know, if a house is on fire, you might say, "Jump!" He shouted. I personally don't like shouted. I prefer it's stupid, it's just a personal preference. I prefer yelled or cried.
Mm.
He cried, she cried. Yeah, I don't know why, but for all I know, it's because you dropped it into my head about shouting. So when I see it, I think, ooh, I think I might tweak that.
Or,
And it's not something I use. Yeah.
or if the description is, if the speech is used properly and the dialogue is used properly, you probably actually don't even need
Yes.
that extra bit of information. Like, you don't have to explain every dialogue's tone.
Mm-hmm.
If you've done a good enough job with the dialogue and the setting, leave it up to the reader to either work out, or it's not needed unless it's pivotal to the story. So for instance, there's a fire and someone is trying to get someone out, then yes, you're going to have a shouted or yelled. But this all goes back to spoon feeding, which we've spoken about a couple of times in this series. You don't have to spoon feed us, the reader, all the time. Leave a lot of that out. Leave a lot of description of how someone is talking out. Because if you're having to describe how they're saying something, go back and take a look at what it is you're saying.
Going back to that "go away" exclamation mark, that should say, from the tone of the scene and everything, as I say, that should say everything that you need to know. If, say, you did add, like, "she snapped," again, that's enough. There's no need to embellish it with an adverb, like tersely or angrily or grumpily. Those adverbs aren't needed. Snapping, is basically angry or grumpy or terse. That's the nature of snapping. The reader doesn't have to have it spelled out for them, as you say. So just think about the words you're using in the speech. Think about the tone of the scene. Think about the setup that you've created in that scene. And what is evident in the choice of speech tag if you use one? Does the reader need a pointer as to how someone is speaking, or is it obvious from the way it's written? And it really should be obvious from the way it's written. If you can get to that point with your dialogue, then that's really helpful. Another way to let the reader know who is speaking is to add in a bit of action. So this is another way to avoid a speech tag. You might have, "I haven't got long," said Harry. "Oh, come on, surely you've got time for a cup of tea." David didn't wait for a response, but marched to the sink and filled the kettle. So you've got said Harry, but then you haven't got said David. You've made it clear it's David who's speaking now because he said the line, and then within that same paragraph, the same paragraph as his speech, you have David then going and doing an action. So it's clear that he is the speaker without having to actually say it. And I think the key with all of it is variety. Sprinkle a bit of this and a bit of that, and that's how you keep it interesting for the reader. And just finally and briefly, how can dialogue drive the plot forward? Characters can reveal things in their conversation. Their conversation can create conflict and misunderstanding. It can expose their fears and uncertainties, alternatively, their hopes and their dreams. It can expose how they feel about other people in the story. It can, drop a secret. It can suggest a solution or create a further difficulty or obstacle. And it does all of that by showing the reader, not by telling the reader. The show don't tell is just such an important concept to grasp with modern writing. People don't want that spoon feeding. They don't want to be spoon fed. They don't want to have everything explained. You want to get people's brains. It's almost like you want to get them there before you. "Oh yes, I've got that." Do you know what I mean? You don't need to just lay it all out. You can jump bits, and the reader will make the connections if you get it right.
And you can probably do quite a bit of that in your self-editing, I would imagine, as well. We mentioned killing your darlings. If there's a specific scene that you really like, that you think is really written well, and you love the way you've described something, you've got adjectives and you've got all this lovely, and then you actually realize it's doing exactly this. Getting rid is probably better than keeping it in. Copy and paste it somewhere else. Don't be afraid to get rid. Don't be afraid to be sparse. Don't be afraid to leave some question marks. As long as you're not losing the reader, there's a difference and a fine balance between moving the pace forward moving the story forward, show, don't tell, as long as you're not then leaving us wondering, huh? How do we get from A to B? Then I absolutely 100% agree. And you don't need, like you said, adjectives with the, she snapped tersely. It's just you don't need it. You don't need it.
No, so paring down. Just think about paring down with your whole manuscript and with your speech as well. Does it say it by itself? Is that enough? Is that enough?
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing to remember as well when you're doing speech, when you're writing speech, is use contractions. That's the word. Use
Yes, yes.
contractions. So very rarely you speak I am, they are, you are, it is. Very rarely do you speak like that unless you are doing that for a reason, a specific reason. Someone try,
Snapping tersely, for
yeah.
example.
People might say, I am absolutely sure, exclamation mark. Like they're saying the words individually for a reason. They're making a point. But most times when people are talking, you use contractions. So it's, there, etc. So that is really important. The other thing to remember as well, and Alexa, you touched on this briefly right at the beginning of this episode, and this is a bit of a tricky one because yes, I agree with colloquialism and developing a character through dialogue with an accent. However, reading long dialogue in a thick Yorkshire accent, spelt as a Yorkshire accent, is really hard.
Yeah, you
Same,
don't want to. Yeah.
same with Cockney. Like, I understand if a character is from London or Cockney London, and I understand you want to show various phrases that they might use, but to read lots of dialogue in proper Cockney accent as it's spelt is actually very difficult. So I would say, and this is, I mean, I'm not an editor. Alexa, you might have a different view on this. I would say if you are writing in character, be someone from Yorkshire or Lancashire or Scotland or from London, you would drop in the occasional word or phrases. Like I know a lot of Scottish people use the word we for small, but you don't completely sort of almost change the language to speak in that particular dialect. Is that right, Alexa?
Yes, yes. Yes. Don't leave it to the reader to do what they want in their head as they're reading, to create that accent, but don't write it because, as you say, if you start using, oh, I don't know, shortening words, using M apostrophe M instead of them, or um, all that kind of thing. You could use ain't.
Yep.
I ain't got it, or something like that.
Or
That's
going to shop. That sounds awful.
yes, touch
But
shop.
you can, because you're not going to have a Yorkshireman talking in clipped English like another character in the book. They
Mm,
are going to speak differently for sure, because they're going to use different phrases, different, words for things I understand, but it has to be done sensitively, I think, and it has to be done cleverly.
mm. And it's a lot of effort for you as a writer to try and translate the language that you know into different sounds to try and
Mm,
copy the sound of the accent.
mm.
So yes, yes, don't do that. No.
I mean, obviously, if you say you've got a Polish character and they're speaking, absolutely, they're going to get tenses wrong. They're going to probably, I'm sorry, this sounds awful. I'm making a massive assumption here, and I don't mean to, because there are some very good fluent English speakers who are from Poland, but I'm making a generalization here. Let's say you've got a baddie that's from Russia, and, he's going to speak with a bit of an accent, right? A good way of showing that is getting the tense wrong or getting a few words not quite right, an extra s on the end. That's great to show character, I think. But because they're not going to probably, unless they're, some KGB MI6 double agent spy that's gone to Oxford University, if they're from a different country, they're going to get the occasional word wrong, and that's fine. And this is where I really think getting a professional editor in will sort those issues out, because I think it needs to be done right and needs to be handled in a way that's genuine, that is easy to read, but yet true to the character themselves.
And consistent. If you're changing a particular word that they say, that it needs to then become part of their speech. That needs to become the word they use. So you have to make sure. I can't think of what the word is, but I edited a book recently where, was it a colloquialism? It was something anyway that was very specific to that character. But as I was working on it, I realized, they don't always say that then. Sometimes they say that. And it felt wrong. It felt as if it had been forgotten rather than that it was deliberately there sometimes and deliberately not there other times. It just felt it needed to be there. It needed to be consistent. So I think, consistency in the language that you're using for certain characters is really important throughout your book.
Yeah, definitely. So, is that everything you've got for dialogue?
It is, yes.
And I've got a very handy blog that I have done that tells you how to format speech, which is in the show notes, as I said at the beginning. But you need to go study it. Go take a look at books that have dialogue in them. See how they format it as well. Because in your self-editing part of your writing journey, before you send it to an editor, it's good to have all of that done. I mean, obviously
We did it.
you're not going to know all of the ins and outs, and we're not expecting you to. But if you can get your book in the best possible shape you possibly can, we've touched on this in another episode. Alexa, you're probably going to tell me which one it was. Is it series 2?
Oh, series 2, yes. Series 2, we talked all about editing.
Yeah.
And we also have done a putty pod more recently about how to punctuate dialogue.
Yeah.
So if you want to have a kind of audio version.
Yes, exactly.
Then,
and what I'll do in the show notes is I will link those episodes so that they're easy to find. Okay. But also, yeah, go and take a look at a book that's got lots of dialogue, see how they've formatted it. If there's a specific book that you love that's written by someone you admire, take a look at their speech tags. I'm afraid to say your Richard Osman is not good with his speech tags, I'm afraid. He says he uses he said, she said all the time after every speech. It's he said or she said, which is just annoying. But anyway, that's just a personal preference I don't like. And make sure you use contractions.
And just quickly, can you use speech effectively in a non-fiction book?
I mean, yes, it should be laid out exactly the same way as it would a fiction book. I've just done a business book recently, actually, where there's a example of a conversation happening between business owner and client. It's generally shorter, obviously, because it's usually just an example of how someone responds to something. But yes, you can to give personality, but it's not really the same. It's not used quite in the same device or
No.
the same way, but it should definitely be laid out the same way with, a new line for when someone new is speaking, as you know. And the same, I mean, these rules apply to children's books as well, children's fiction books. The other series of books that we work on, Alexa, as you know, has lots of speech in it. In fact, it's mainly speech. And you've got to remember that if you're going to have someone new talking and each speech is going to be on a new line, you've got to think of how much space that's going to take up on the page versus where the picture's going to come. So bear in mind with that, because if you've only got a certain amount of space for text before the new page comes on, and there's a key part of that dialogue that then refers to the picture, just make sure obviously that you've allowed enough space so the picture is on the corresponding page of where it appears. Bear that in mind. But that's
Okay, well, I
that's
think that's
everything.
Yes, for this week.
That is everything from us this week. Next week, we're going to be talking about character arcs. Alexa Tewksbury is going to be delving into the very exciting subject of developing your characters and how they progress. And we touched on this in the first 2 episodes of this series about the fact that, you want to take your character on a bit of a self-discovery journey from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And I think that's really important. But that's going to be next week. So I hope you've enjoyed this one. Please do go and rate us and review. We got a lovely testimonial last week about an episode, and it is just such a delight to get those, because then we feel like we're delivering what it is you want to learn and hear from us. So from us, from me, certainly, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.